Change your DNA!
Vaccines have become both the villain and the hero of the coronavirus story. 1 in 4 Americans don't want to get vaccinated. Hesitation is being fueled by concerns over side effects and also by misinformation.
I don't think people really understand that they're taking an experimental product.
We will never know whether the vaccine is killing more people than it's saving.
Before COVID hit, the number of Americans who thought vaccinations were important had been declining for 20 years. But vaccines have wiped out 2 of the world's deadliest diseases already. So why, at a time of such great need, has faith in vaccines fallen so low?
We're sounding the alarm, people!
It was vaccines that saved millions from one of the world's deadliest diseases over 200 years ago. The disease was smallpox. It's estimated that it claimed 500 million lives, more than the toll from both world wars. But when the vaccine was first created by a British doctor, many were afraid they would turn into cows. The story goes that in 1796, Edward Jenner developed a vaccine after he noticed that the only ones who were immune to smallpox were milkmaids. And that's because they'd been infected with a similar but less deadly virus than smallpox, transmitted by cows. So he took material from lesions on the milkmaids' hands and developed what became known as vaccines. Vacca means cow in Latin. The treatment slowly gained support and the tide began to turn against the disease. So in the mid-1800s, some governments decided to make it mandatory. But with the rise of vaccines also came another phenomenon.
The organized resistance to that vaccine was really about a mandate that the government put on. It wasn't actually against the vaccine itself.
A challenge against the mandate in the US made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. But the court ruled it was legal to require vaccinations during a health crisis. In the US, smallpox had almost disappeared by the 1930s, but as one threat was removed, another was brewing: polio.
Few diseases are capable of causing as much terror in the hearts and minds of fathers and mothers as infantile paralysis.
The virus had been around for hundreds of years, but cases started to peak in America in the 1940s. It disabled about 35,000 people every year in the US, among them President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Patients who couldn't breathe had to be connected to iron lungs.
The tireless machine keeps him alive by doing mechanically the work his chest muscles did.
When a nationwide call for donations went out in 1938, millions of people sent in dimes to the White House to help the president find a cure.
America's all-out war against the dread disease depends upon the hearts and pocketbooks of all who can spare even a dime.
More than 2.5 million dimes were sent to the White House, raising more than $250,000, which would be more than $5 million today. That paid for the largest vaccine trial the country had ever seen. And time was of the essence. By 1952, there were more than 50,000 cases of polio in the US. The following year, Dr. Jonas Salk successfully developed a vaccine. In 1954, clinical trials began.
The parents of 440,000 grammar school children in 44 states gave their permission for injections of the preventive series of 3 Salk shots.
And the year after, a nationwide campaign of inoculations got underway.
This miss isn't quite sure about the whole thing, but, well, it really wasn't so bad.
But then the worst happened. More than 40,000 children were accidentally infected with polio by vaccines made at Qatar laboratories. About 200 were paralyzed and 10 died.
It was the worst biological disaster in this country's history. But if you listen to the exit interviews associated with all those lawsuits, people trusted the companies. They thought it was what it was, which is a process of evolution.
The incident led to a flood of lawsuits, and the vaccination program was suspended. But once the program resumed, polio cases dropped dramatically throughout the 1960s. In the 70s, there was also a global push to vaccinate as many people as possible against other diseases like measles and tuberculosis. The last polio case in the US was in 1979, and the next year smallpox was eradicated worldwide, seen as one of the greatest achievements of public health. Over the next 10 years, vaccination rates escalated rapidly around the world.
And there was also an incredible investment in communications, in engaging all types of people in society about this movement to save children's lives.
But just as vaccines appeared to be enjoying a golden age of success, NBC dropped a bombshell that would forever change the way Americans thought about them.
The whooping cough or pertussis vaccine is the most unstable, least reliable vaccine we give our children.
Reporter Leah Thompson wrongly claimed the DTP shots caused brain damage.
We were on the verge of losing vaccines for American children.
Angry parents got together and formed a powerful anti-vaccination group that became a $1 million organization in the US. Claims from hundreds of lawsuits came to over $1 billion, even though researchers found no connection between the vaccine and brain damage. But by then the anti-vaccination movement had received a boost, and the damage to the credibility of the DTP vaccine was done. Another vaccine would suffer a similar fate, the MMR vaccine against measles, mumps and rubella. In 1998, British Dr. Andrew Wakefield falsely claimed there was a link between the vaccine and autism.
Vaccination is about the same time that parents start seeing symptoms of autism, and so it made sense.
This also happened to be the year that Google was launched. Fear spread online like wildfire. Vaccination rates for MMR dropped in Europe, and there were outbreaks of measles. But Wakefield didn't disclose that he received funding from a lawyer representing parents of children with autism. And researchers never found a link between the vaccine and autism. Wakefield lost his license and his report was retracted, but it was too late.
Many would have moved on. That didn't happen with Andrew Wakefield.
Wakefield moved to the US, where he found a following. Among them, actress Jenny McCarthy.
We have a lot of distrust now in the healthcare system and in our doctors.
She claimed her son Evan developed autism after vaccination. The number of parents in the US who had concerns about vaccines grew over the next decade. The dip in trust was mirrored by a spike in cases of preventable diseases.
15 years after U.S. health officials declared measles had been eliminated from our country, the virus is roaring back into the headlines tonight.
In 2019, there were more than 1,000 cases of measles in the US. That same year, the World Health Organization called vaccine hesitancy a global threat. And then what many scientists feared the most happened: a new pandemic. COVID spread unchecked around the world, killing more than 500,000 people in 6 months. A global race for a vaccine was on. Stuck in lockdown, the vast majority of Americans said in May of 2020 they wanted to get vaccinated. For others, the rush for a vaccine was a cause of major concern. But not for experts like Dr. Offit. He developed the rotavirus vaccine and now sits on the FDA board that reviews COVID vaccines.
The size of the trials is typical of any adult or pediatric vaccine trial. The safety follow-up, pre-approval, was the same for any vaccine.
It can take more than 10 years for a new vaccine to get approved, but in this case, pharmaceutical companies achieved it in 1.
Money was the difference.
The Trump administration set aside more than $18 billion for vaccines.
It's called Operation Warp Speed. That means big and it means fast.
At the same time, the anti-vax movement was also gaining momentum.
I would divide sort of this anti-vaccine sentiment into 2 categories. One is skeptics. The second group, the vaccine cynic, are just conspiracy theorists. There is no convincing them.
I think the big strategic error that governments have made is they put all of their bets into the vaccine basket without looking at other alternatives, at therapeutic alternatives.
Kennedy has been a leading voice among vaccine skeptics, often spreading misinformation, like the debunked claim that vaccines contain ingredients that can cause brain damage.
I think the government has an agenda. The CDC has an agenda, which is to, convince people that all vaccines are safe.
A July 2020 study looked into more than 400 anti-vax social media accounts. Together they had about 58 million followers. Kennedy's Instagram account, with about 800,000 followers, was shut down in February as social media giants tried to combat fake news.
There's not a single false statement that anybody has ever been able to show me on my Instagram about vaccines. It was taken down for political reasons.
It's a big challenge because shutting down a page in Facebook is not going to make the emotions and perceptions and issues go away.
Anti-vaxxers labelled vaccines poison, falsely claimed that they altered our DNA, and even framed Bill Gates as the villain. Then in September 2020, drug maker AstraZeneca said they had to pause their trial because a participant had had an adverse reaction, and the number of people in favour of vaccination dropped. But when Pfizer's vaccine was approved for use in December 2020, a wave of optimism saw confidence rebound.
I've seen a lot of pain, suffering, death. It was important for me to get the vaccine today to promote public confidence in the safety of the vaccine.
It marked the start of the largest vaccination campaign in the country's history. The goal was ambitious.
Hundreds of millions of doses will be available every month, and we expect to have enough vaccines for every American by April.
A month after the vaccine was FDA approved for emergency use, about 30 million doses were shipped, but less than half were administered in the first few weeks because of logistical problems. Hesitancy remained a stubborn adversary.
People who don't want to take vaccines or who hesitate, it's a whole mix of reasons. Marginalized experiences, needle anxiety,
or simply politics. Only half of Republicans said in April 2021 they wanted to get vaccinated, compared to more than 90% of Democrats.
I think you should be skeptical of anything you put into your body, including vaccines. I think the problem is cynicism, that people just believe that there's these conspiracies that are working against them.
Once they take that shot, they are altering their DNA forever and ever. They can never go back.
But by the end of May, half of the population had received at least one dose. But it is still not clear whether vaccines will achieve the roughly 70% uptake experts say is needed to achieve herd immunity. Some vaccination sites have even been forced to close because no one was showing up. Hesitancy alongside new COVID variants are the twin threats now standing between the US and victory over the pandemic. And after more than 200 years of scientific discovery and progress, and with over 4 million lives now saved globally each year, it looks like vaccines have nonetheless met their match.
They're just calling us conspiracy theorists and right-wing nutjobs. These people want us dead.
These vaccines are experimental gene therapy.